Have you ever bumped into a door and said sorry to the door? Have you ever found yourself in the middle of someone else's argument and before you even understood what was happening, the word sorry had already left your mouth? If this sounds familiar, you are not alone, and more importantly, you are not simply being polite. What you are doing is something far deeper, far more layered, and far more emotionally significant than good manners. You are living inside a pattern that was built long before you had any say in the matter. Today, we are going to sit with that pattern, understand it, and most importantly, treat it with the compassion it deserves. There is a specific kind of person who apologizes constantly. They say sorry when someone bumps into them on the street. They say sorry before asking a question. They say sorry for taking up space in a conversation, for having a need, for existing in a way that might even slightly inconvenience another person. And if you look closely enough at this person, what you will find is not weakness. What you will find is someone who learned very early in life that the world around them was safer when they kept themselves small. To understand why people over-apologize, we have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the habit, but the beginning of the person. Most chronic apologizers developed this behavior in childhood, in environments where conflict felt dangerous. Perhaps they grew up in a home where a parent's mood was unpredictable, and a quick, "I'm sorry," was the fastest way to de-escalate tension before it became something frightening. Perhaps they were raised by someone who responded to a child's normal emotional expression, crying, being upset, needing something, with frustration or withdrawal. Over time, the child learned a critical survival lesson. My feelings, my needs, and my presence can cause problems. And if I apologize first, maybe I can prevent the storm before it starts. This is not a character flaw. This is a child doing what all children do, adapting to their environment in the most intelligent way they know how. The tragedy is not that the child learned to apologize. The tragedy is that the strategy worked, and because it worked, it got reinforced, repeated, and eventually carried into adulthood as the default setting for navigating the world. In adulthood, this pattern shows up in ways that can quietly erode a person's sense of self-worth. The chronic apologizer at work is the one who says sorry to bother you before every email, who takes the blame when a project goes sideways even if they had nothing to do with the failure, who shrinks their ideas in meetings because they are terrified of being perceived as too much. In friendships, they are the ones who apologize when a friend cancels on them. In romantic relationships, they are the ones who say sorry after their partner raises their voice, even when they were the ones being spoken to harshly. They apologize for being sad. They apologize for being sick. They apologize for needing time, for needing love, for needing anything at all. And here is the painful irony buried inside all of this. These are often the most empathetic, emotionally intelligent, deeply caring people you will ever meet. Their sensitivity to other people's feelings is extraordinary, but that same sensitivity has been turned inward as a weapon, convincing them that their own feelings are less important, less valid, and potentially dangerous to express. Psychologists refer to this pattern as fawn response, one of the 4 survival responses alongside fight, flight, and freeze. The fawn response is what happens when a person learns that the safest way to survive emotional or physical threat is to immediately appease, to comply, to smooth things over at all costs. And while fight, flight, and freeze are relatively well known, the fawn response is perhaps the most socially invisible because it looks on the surface like kindness. It looks like being easygoing. It looks like someone who never causes trouble. But underneath that surface is a nervous system that is working overtime, constantly scanning the environment for signs of displeasure, constantly ready to offer an apology as a shield before any conflict can take shape. There is also a deep connection between over-apologizing and anxiety. When you live with a persistent, low-level hum of anxiety, the world can feel like a place filled with invisible social landmines. Every interaction carries the potential for misunderstanding, for offense, for disapproval. The apology becomes a preemptive strike, a way of managing that anxiety by controlling the narrative before anyone else can. If I apologize first, then no one can be angry with me. If I take the blame, then the situation resolves faster. It makes sense. It is logical within the emotional framework this person has been operating inside for most of their life. But here is what over-apologizing costs. It costs you your sense of reality. When you apologize for things that are not your fault, you begin to internalize the message that you are at fault for things you cannot control, for other people's moods, for the ordinary inconveniences of being a human being in the world. Over time, this creates a distorted self-perception. You begin to see yourself as someone who is always in the way, always a little too much, always a little too needy. And none of that is true. But the repetition of the apology plants the seed of that belief, and the belief grows quietly in the background of everything you do. It also communicates something to the people around you, not the message you intend, but a message nonetheless. When you apologize for things that are not your fault, some people will take that apology at face value and begin to believe that you are indeed responsible. It can inadvertently shift the power dynamics in relationships, leading others to hold you accountable for things you never should have owned. The apology that was meant to keep the peace can, over time, become a mechanism that invites exactly the dynamic you were trying to avoid. So what does healing look like for someone caught inside this pattern? It does not look like suddenly becoming someone who never apologizes. Apologies are important. They are a cornerstone of human connection and accountability. The goal is not to eliminate them, but to make them meaningful again, to reserve them for the moments when they are genuinely warranted, rather than deploying them as an automatic reflex every time you feel the slightest anxiety about how you are being perceived. Healing begins with awareness. It begins with noticing the apology before it leaves your mouth and asking yourself one simple question: did I actually do something that caused harm here? If the answer is no, you get to pause. You get to take a breath. And instead of "I'm sorry," you might experiment with "thank you for your patience," or "I appreciate your understanding," or sometimes nothing at all. Because silence is also something you are allowed to occupy. Healing also asks you to reconnect with the needs and feelings you were taught to suppress. It asks you to practice, slowly and gently, the radical act of believing that your presence is not an imposition, that your needs are not a burden, that you do not need to earn your place in a room, in a relationship, in a conversation, or in your own life. This is not easy work. It is quiet, slow, and sometimes deeply emotional. But it is possible, and it begins the moment you decide that you are no longer willing to apologize for being who you are. You were never the problem. You were simply someone who learned to act like you were. And that is a lesson that can be unlearned, one honest, unapologetic breath at a time.